Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, I want to talk about why we breathe. When I start talking about the respiratory system in one of my classes, I usually ask the students, why do you breathe? And the kind of answers that I usually get right up front are to get oxygen, and that's true. To get rid of CO2, and that's true. But why? Why do you have to take in oxygen? And why do you have to get rid of CO2? What's going on inside of there? So I'm going to take you through the basic gist of why we breathe from a physiological standpoint with only just a touch of anatomy. So let's say we got a person here, they're happy and they're breathing, and as we said, they're bringing in oxygen and they're breathing out CO2. These gases, as we breathe in and out, we bring these gases down into our lungs, and I'm just going to simply represent lungs this way. So those are supposed to be lungs. Inside of the lungs, these respiratory gases are exchanged with blood. So oxygen diffuses into the blood, and CO2 diffuses out of the blood into the oxygen diffuses from the air in your lungs into the blood that's running through your lungs. And the CO2, the carbon dioxide, diffuses from the blood in your lungs out into the air that's in your lungs. We actually call that external respiration. That external respiration, that is the exchange of gases that occurs in the lungs, between the air in your lungs and the blood in your lungs. That brings in the oxygen into the bloodstream. So here, this is supposed to be the bloodstream, oxygen coming in via the bloodstream. We covered cardiovascular system and when we've gotten to this point, so my students already know that blood is a transport medium, and the heart and the blood vessel's job is to push that blood around the body. The heart pumps that blood and the blood vessels carry that blood. That blood has oxygen in it. That oxygen, because of the cardiovascular system, gets delivered to all of the living cells in your body. So let's just represent one cell living in your body. I don't know, maybe this is a skin cell. There's the nucleus. There's one other organelle that you have to understand to get what's going on here, and I'm just going to draw it kind of dramatically maybe. This organelle is supposed to be a mitochondria, and you might remember it from a basic bio class at some point as being the powerhouse of the cell. It's the mitochondria that uses that oxygen. And there's something I skipped before we got here, because remember we were in blood over here? There's another term over here is external respiration, exchange of gases between blood and air, right? Exchange of gases between blood and air. Over here, between the blood and the tissue where the cell lives, there's another exchange. It's called internal respiration. And that is exchange of gases again, but this time between blood and tissues. Whether it's muscle tissue in one of your muscles or nervous tissue inside of your brain, the exchange of gases between that tissue and the bloodstream. That's how the cell and the mitochondria in the cell eventually gets to have this oxygen. So it was breathed in, the oxygen was breathed in over here. External respiration made sure that the oxygen got into the bloodstream. The blood carried the oxygen to the tissue, and then there was internal respiration. Oxygen left the bloodstream and went into the tissue, and then the oxygen diffuses into the cell, and then it diffuses to the mitochondria. Okay. Here's what the mitochondria does. It takes food molecules like sugars and lipids, fats, free fatty acids floating in the bloodstream too, sugars floating in the bloodstream too, they get in here. And then there's one other one. If we're starving to death, you can also use protein, but we don't usually use protein for energy. And energy is the key here. Energy is in these food molecules, and the mitochondria is able to get energy from those food molecules, but it needs the oxygen. It needs the oxygen to be able to liberate the energy from these food molecules. And what it uses that energy to do is to make ATP. You might recall from maybe the muscles unit or another unit, ATP is energy. You can think of it that way. It is the energy currency inside of all living cells. The cells use the energy in the ATP. You can think of it as the energy for life. And that then turns that ATP into ADP plus a phosphate group. And then the mitochondria, using energy from the food molecules, able to get that energy because the oxygen allows it. Bringing in that oxygen is what lets the mitochondria get energy from these food molecules. It regenerates that ATP, it recycles it. And this part of the arrow over here, you could think used for life. For whatever it is that you're doing to stay alive or be active or whatever it is, whether it's a muscle cell using this ATP to move, or the brain using this ATP to be able to do the thinking that you do, that sort of thing, or the heart using this energy in order to keep beating, to push this blood around, or the respiratory system using energy to be able to breathe in and out. Your whole body uses energy in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so that's the oxygen side of things. There is something that you need to get rid of course, and that is CO2. That carbon dioxide is actually coming from these guys. The carbon dioxide is coming from the sugars or the lipids that your cell is breaking down for its energy. These are organic molecules, and that means they contain carbon, and carbon covalently bonded to hydrogen atoms, and that's the bond that we're breaking in order to generate this ATP. And the carbons coming out of the food molecules, we got to get rid of those carbons, and that's what the CO2 is all about. So that CO2 is exchanged between the tissue and the bloodstream via internal respiration, and then the blood carries that CO2 back to the lungs, and then in the lungs, external respiration is also happening, of course, and in this case, the CO2 is diffusing from the blood in your lungs out into the air in your lungs, and then you're able to breathe it out. So that's the full story of why we breathe. And the big thing to get from this, there's no energy in oxygen really. There's some energy in oxygen, but your body's not using any energy out of this oxygen. But it is the oxygen that allows your cells to get energy from the food that you eat. So your breathing has a lot to do with energy, because again, the oxygen is what allows you to get energy from these food molecules. Where this matters to my future nursing students or my future physicians, who whatever you want to be when you grow up, it explains why if a patient is having trouble breathing, like they've got severe asthma or they've got end-stage COPD, they are having to use a ton of energy just to breathe. And the reason we're breathing in the first place is so that we can get energy. So if you're having to expend a ton of energy just to get enough oxygen to do the things you need to do to stay alive, then any extra energy expenditure is, you can't do it. You're just spending so much energy just to be able to breathe that you don't have a lot of energy for anything else. So the person with COPD, for example, they might get up out of their chair, walk to the bathroom, and they have to stop halfway to be able to catch their breath. because just that energy needed to get up and take that little bit of a walk was too much extra energy usage, because they're expending so much energy just to be able to breathe. So breathing does have a relationship to energy, but again, you're not breathing in energy, you're breathing in oxygen, and the oxygen allows you to liberate energy from these food molecules, and that's how your cells end up getting energy, is from those food molecules. But it needs the oxygen in order to do it. And that's why we breathe. You also breathe to maintain pH homeostasis, by the way. I talked about that in another video, the bicarbonate buffer system. So if you haven't seen that, you might take a look. And that has to do with carbon dioxide levels and pH in the body. So let's take a step back here and see what you can remember. I'm going to get rid of your hints. That's probably enough there. Big and tough question, and a long one to write out as an essay. Why do we breathe? And you could walk through everything I just talked about here in terms of fully understanding why it is that we breathe. But let's take it apart piece by piece. What are the two respiratory gases? The two major respiratory gases, what are they? And that's easy because they're written right here, aren't they? Carbon dioxide and oxygen, those are the two major respiratory gases. What do we mean when we say external versus internal respiration? The answer to those, external respiration, it's happening at the lungs, and it's the exchange of gases between the air in the lungs and the blood in the lungs. The blood in the alveolar capillaries in the lungs. That's external respiration. And then internal respiration is happening somewhere over here. Here's the CO2 and oxygen in the bloodstream. The exchange of gases between the blood in the tissues and the capillary beds in the tissues. The exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues where the cells live. That's internal respiration. Why do we need oxygen? What do we use that oxygen for? And I hope with what you came up with there is the oxygen is needed in order for the mitochondria to do what the mitochondria does. And what the mitochondria does is it gets energy from food molecules and uses that energy to generate ATP. The mitochondria needs the oxygen in order to do that. Another way to say it, the mitochondria needs oxygen in order to liberate energy from these food molecules and make ATP. And the cells need that ATP as energy for life. Something I skipped. Sorry, but I'm coming back to it. We talked about external respiration. We talked about internal respiration, the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues. What the mitochondria does, what that mitochondria does is part of what we call cellular respiration. It's more complicated than this, but to put it simply, you can think of cellular respiration as answering the question of how do living cells get energy? How do they get energy? And there is always an exchange of gases when we talk about how living cells get energy, at least so far in the ways we've been able to examine how cells get energy. And here I'm talking about not just human cells, but bacterial cells, etc. They all get energy, and we call that cellular respiration. And in the case of human cells, this cellular respiration involves the exchange of these two gases at the mitochondria, basically, of oxygen and CO2. Oxygen being used to do the cellular respiration thing to get energy from the food molecules, and CO2 as a waste product from that process. Where's that CO2 coming from, by the way, exactly? Where's the carbon coming from? And the answer to that is these carbon atoms, they're coming from the food. And I always think that's kind of fun. So the carbon is coming from the carbon skeletons and the sugars and the lipids and the proteins and whatever you ate last week or a couple days ago. So for me right now, as I'm breathing out carbon atoms that came from the shepherd's pie that I had a couple of days ago, for example. I always find that kind of fun and fascinating. Or maybe I'm breathing out carbon dioxide from the carbons from the tacos I ate last week or whatever. So anyway, I hope this is helping you understand exactly why it is that we breathe. That's the major goal of this. And at the same time, I've covered external respiration and internal respiration, and then finally I covered cellular respiration. There's one other meaning to that word respiration in medical terms, and that is ventilation, which is this. Ventilation means breathing in and out of your lungs, but often, at least in American medicine, we talk about respirations. How many times does a patient breathe in 1 minute? That's counting their respirations. So there's 4 meanings to that idea of respirations. There's breathing in and out. That's often what we mean when we say respirations. But then there's also external respiration, the exchange of gases between the air and the blood inside of the lungs. That's external respiration. And then the blood carries those gases down to the capillary beds and the tissue. And we have internal respiration, the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues where the cells live. So that's internal respiration. And then lastly, we've got cellular respiration. In the case of humans, cellular respiration at least includes the mitochondria using that oxygen to liberate energy from the food molecules in order that we have this ATP, this energy to sustain life and to do the things that life does. And that's why we breathe in a relatively long nutshell. I hope it helps you understand. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. And thank you for watching.